This is clearly a very complex issue when it comes to bighorn sheep.
I was a federal land rancher and a sportsman that has loved to hunt and fish my whole life. I firmly believe that agriculture and sportsmen's goals are very closely tied together.
The process of reintroducing bighorn sheep in Wyoming really goes through something that's unique to Wyoming, and that's what we call the Wyoming Plan. The Wyoming Plan allows us to manage sheep at a statewide level, and it allows us to come to the table with our agricultural partners and talk through both bighorn and domestic sheep management, because they can at times be at odds because of disease issues.
A couple years ago, we were asked and worked in collaboration with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to address the question of whether or not Sweetwater Rocks contained viable sheep habitat and whether or not there's a heightened risk of contact with domestic livestock, in particular domestic sheep. The primary concern there is, of course, as we've all talked about in the sheep world for a number of years, pneumonia. So that bacterial complex that, as we know, domestic sheep can be carriers of it and can persist with it without any major issues typically. But that initial contact with our bighorn sheep populations can result in epizootic die-offs, can wipe out a sheep population, or result in just chronically suppressed growth within a sheep herd for a long period of time.
This is pretty cool country. It's very diverse. You've got these Sweetwater Rocks. They're the largest sand dunes in the continental United States here, go from Eden Farson to Casper. They're huge dunes, mostly covered by sagebrush. And it's good cattle country, but it's hard winter country. Because of the interaction working group and getting together, the state was divided into non-emphasis areas, which were basically left for domestic sheep. And not that you can't have wild sheep there, but they are not any part to do with the management. There's a cooperative review areas, which we're in now, where domestics and wild sheep can work together to do transplants, or technically if they want to change a cattle allotment into a domestic allotment, they should have to go through that same interaction working group. The third classification was the core native herds, which is the northwest corner of the state. They're the herds that had never been taken out, they've never been supplemented. And in those core native herds, then the bighorn sheep management took precedent.
Split Rock Ranch is amazing in the fact that it's a relatively intact landscape scale ecosystem that doesn't have a lot of influence from industry, human presence with roads, power lines, development, or even things such as noxious weeds or invasive species. It's a lot like it was probably 150, 200 years ago. I think there's no better place in the United States for the reintroduction of bighorn sheep than Split Rock Ranch and adjoining properties in the Granite Mountain Range.
One of the challenges of reintroduction, and in this case wild sheep back into Wyoming, has been the wild sheep on federal land and livestock grazing permit relationship. There's those that feel wild sheep as a wildlife species within their livestock grazing permit will add an extra layer of bureaucracy or of management that will then impede their ability to raise livestock.
Where the concern arises is because federal agencies, although BLM and U.S. Forest Service sat at the table during the development of the Wyoming Bighorn Domestic Sheep Plan, they were not formal signatories to the plan and are not legally bound by the plan.
Where we're proposing the reintroduction, there's no active domestic sheep allotments or producers in this very area. However, there are domestic sheep allotments in the larger area, and so there are concerns from the wildlife side that potentially bighorn sheep could wander into those domestic sheep areas and come back with disease that could affect the herd. However, the Wyoming Game and Fish has done a novel thing and said, we will be the mechanism of separation and we'll manage the sheep in this area so that there is little chance of them wandering towards domestic sheep.
Translocation of sheep has been one of the primary tools that has been used to restore sheep across much of their historical range. And so given that that would be the context for consideration of whether or not Sweetwater Rocks would be a viable option, a lot of what matters relative to whether or not a translocation and reintroduction of sheep is successful is one, whether or not the habitat there is viable for sheep, but then on the other side of that is what sheep are brought in. And as we've come to appreciate, animals are very much adapted to their localized environment.
So the first part of this modeling tactic that we used was just a habitat assessment to look at how suitable the habitat is within Sweetwater Rocks. A lot of the variables were topographic, so how much escape terrain is there? How much of the area has slopes greater than 60 degrees? How much good quality food there is in that area? And so with this model, you can just plug in all of those different variables that sheep might be attracted to, and then it will give you this predicted surface, and it can show you on a map these little pockets are really high quality habitat for bighorn sheep.
The power behind what we've been able to do to understand whether or not Sweetwater Rocks is a viable option for translocation of sheep is we have Ferris Seminole sheep that live almost right next door. But one of the primary commonalities of sheep habitat across sheep range is access to escape terrain. We don't see sheep use the plains essentially. They're tied to this steep, rocky escape habitat. Once we apply those models for Sweetwater Rocks, the risk of contact is very low, to the odds of 0.03 risks of contact per year. What we see with regards to risk of contact, if there were 50 sheep that were put in Sweetwater Rocks, and we compare that to the current probability risk of contact within Ferris Seminole, Ferris Seminole actually has twice the probability of a risk of contact than would Sweetwater Rocks based on the application of our same predictive model. The outcome of that analytical exercise is that there is certainly high quality sheep habitat within Sweetwater Rocks.
The Oregon Trail is the southern boundary of the Sweetwater Rocks. And you know from their journals and from the multitude of history of the documentation that they were looking at wild sheep in the Sweetwater Rocks. If not for the hand of man, that would still be the case. But through our involvement as moving through industry and agriculture and just a human population, we have allowed certain things like specifically wild sheep in the Sweetwater Rocks to go by the wayside.
The Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation really feels that it's important to have a diversity of bighorn sheep across our landscape in Wyoming, important to have isolated pockets of bighorn sheep across the state so that if we have a disease die-off in one of our herds, we still have that stronghold of another herd somewhere else. And to us, that's important to the agricultural community because we don't want to get into another situation like we've gotten into with sage grouse. We want to avoid that by putting more sheep on the landscape. Another reason this is really important to Wyoming and to me is to uphold the Wyoming plan and show that the Wyoming way works.
The main part of my job is working within policy. I spend a large part of my time at the Wyoming State Legislature. I also work at the national legislative level. And being at this table, watching the Wyoming plan work as these discussions are happening, it's so much more intimate and relationship-based than a lot of the policy that I've been involved in, especially at the national level. That's the beauty of what Wyoming can do, is we can sit across the table from each other and disagree a lot, but still understand that our core common value is common. It's the same thing. There's no one here that doesn't want to see sheep in the rocks. We're just trying to figure out how, and how we do it in a way that people are protected who are on the ground.
Because of our land ownership patterns in Wyoming, particularly in central and western Wyoming, you can't have a viable ranching operation if you don't have the ability to look at that combination of private, state, and federal lands and manage it as a unit to meet the needs of livestock grazing. And that's where that becomes a challenge for us with many things, but the bighorn sheep being one of those challenges. I think it's so critical that there, or if not somewhere, that we're able to demonstrate that the concepts in the Wyoming Bighorn Domestic Sheep Plan can in fact work.
Part of this Wyoming plan is a commitment to be there and to defend our family around the table that is what Wyoming is.
This cooperative review area can come up with something, and I think it's important that we show that the Wyoming plan works.
We're a time capsule of places that just don't exist in many other places, and Sweetwater Rocks is the perfect example. You can look at historical photos of this place and not much has changed from 100 years, except the lack of sheep now. And it feels like a human obligation. It feels like a participant of the landscape obligation, and Wyoming should be turning backflips to make that happen.
Wyoming Wild Sheep Foundation is an original signatory to the plan, and as such, we are making a commitment to our partners in both agriculture and wildlife to uphold that plan.
It's a perfect storm for Wyoming to get back an iconic species and an iconic landscape. It's something that we name our mountain ranges after, our rivers after, our reservoirs after, our team mascots after. There's no better place, and this is the right time.
Bighorn sheep are the essence of wild. They are Wyoming.